In the autumn of 1347, 12 battered ships drifted into the harbor of Messina, Sicily. The sailors aboard were already dying, their bodies covered in painful black swellings that oozed blood and pus. Within days, this unseen terror had a name, whispered in fear across the continent: the Black Death. The path to Messina began a year earlier during the Mongol siege of Caffa. As plague ravaged the Mongol army, their commanders used catapults to hurl infected corpses over the city walls, one of the earliest recorded acts of biological warfare. Fleeing merchants unknowingly carried the Yersinia pestis bacteria with them, bringing the disease into the heart of European trade. This map shows how the disease raced northward from the Italian ports. By 1348, it had swept through France and crossed the English Channel. By 1350, it reached Scandinavia and Germany. No city, village, or social class was spared. The plague struck kings and peasants with the same indifference. To see the scale of the loss, look at the difference in these two columns. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague claimed an estimated 25 to 50 million lives. In the hardest-hit regions, the mortality rate reached 60%, effectively wiping out more than half of the population in just 4 years. Chroniclers like Giovanni Boccaccio described streets littered with bodies and mass graves so full that layers of earth barely covered the dead. This image captures the frantic reality of those years, where the sheer number of victims made traditional funeral rites impossible. The speed of the mortality was terrifying. Many went from perfect health to death in a matter of days. For those who survived, the sudden collapse of their communities made it feel as though the world itself was ending. As traditional logic failed, society turned to extremes. Some blamed a deadly alignment of the planets, while others saw the plague as divine punishment. Bands of flagellants roamed the countryside, weeping their own flesh with iron-spiked scourges in a desperate attempt to appease God's wrath. This atmosphere of terror led to a search for scapegoats. Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells to spread the disease, leading to violent pogroms. In cities like Strasbourg, thousands were murdered by neighbors fueled by fear and long-standing prejudice. The Church, which had long served as the primary authority for spiritual and physical protection, saw its influence crumble. Clergy died in massive numbers, and as prayers went unanswered, many survivors began to question the institutional power that had defined their lives for centuries. Law and order fractured as communities ceased to exist overnight. With the death of local officials and the abandonment of farms, the social fabric that had held medieval Europe together began to pull apart. With half the continent gone and its foundational institutions unable to cope, a structural vacuum emerged. The old rules no longer applied, creating a scenario where the surviving population would have to find a different way to function. While the loss of life was a catastrophe, the immediate economic result was a transformation of the labor market. Because the massive agricultural workforce had completely vanished across the continent, those resilient few who survived were suddenly in exceptionally high demand. This graph illustrates the sudden shift in leverage. As the labor pool plummeted, the value of the surviving peasants and artisans spiked. For the first time, laborers could demand and receive vastly higher wages for their work. Looking at the decline in estate value, we can see the impact on the ruling class. Landlords who had once held near absolute authority were now forced to negotiate with their workers or watch their crops rot in the fields. As serfs realized they could simply walk away to seek better pay elsewhere, the rigid feudal system began to crack. Abandoned farms reverted to wilderness, and landholders were forced to offer concessions to keep their estates from falling into ruin. To understand why this mattered, we have to look at the Malthusian cycle. Before the plague, Europe was overpopulated and trapped in subsistence living. Any increase in food was immediately consumed by population growth, keeping most people in permanent poverty. The plague broke this cycle. With fewer people to feed, the survivors inherited the land, tools, and property of deceased relatives. Wealth that had been spread thin across a massive population was suddenly concentrated in the hands of the survivors. This created an entirely new kind of social mobility. Ordinary people now had the economic power to choose where they lived and how they worked, freedoms that were unthinkable just a decade earlier. By destroying the old economic chains, the mass death inadvertently gave the lower classes the resources to rebuild society on their own terms. Having witnessed the failure of the old order, survivors began to look for different answers. The trauma of the plague prompted deeper questions about the nature of life and the reliability of religious dogma. Thinkers began to turn away from pure theology, looking instead toward reason, observation, and the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts. They sought practical solutions to the mysteries that spiritual authority had failed to solve. This shift is visible in the rise of humanism. As seen in this fresco, art moved away from stiff, symbolic religious icons and toward realistic portrayals of the human form. Artists began to celebrate the physical world and the individual human experience. By prioritizing human experience and observable nature over established dogma, survivors began a shift toward practical inquiry, solving problems through observation rather than waiting for divine intervention. The plague didn't vanish, it returned in recurring waves for centuries. These repeated strikes kept the population growth slow, ensuring that the labor shortage and the high wages that came with it lasted for generations. The space created by the collapse of the Old World allowed for the eventual rise of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the economic structures that define the modern age. The Black Death ended the rigid dependency of serfdom and the iron grip of absolute feudal authority. It broke the cycle that had kept the majority of the population bound to the land without any hope of advancement. When faced with an apocalyptic event, humanity refused to surrender. Instead, survivors used the loss of the old world to build a society that was more curious, more innovative, and more focused on the potential of the individual. That resilience is the true legacy of the Black Death.